Appreciate everybody joining us back here for another episode of Chain Reaction. Tariffs used to be a footnote in trade policy, and today they're a headline driver of cost, capacity, and competitiveness. Who hasn't been talking about tariffs recently? From semiconductor shortages to rare earth dependencies, the global supply chain is being reshaped by economic nationalism, security strategy, and new waves of automation. Our guest today is Dan Krouse. He's been that center of transformation from building Hallmark's Far East operation and leading the 1.6 billion in global procurement to now advising companies on tariff strategy and supply chain resilience. I mean, his message is pretty clear. The modern economy, supply chains do not survive disruption. They thrive because of it. Dan, I mean, you're a founder, you're a principal consultant of supply chain analytics, which we're going to talk about because that's unique. That's your website, right? Supply chain
Yep.
analytics.ai. Done a lot of advising. You've done a lot of stuff. You've recently just authored the $1.5 billion signal, how China rare earths gambit backfired. So you're an author. You've done a lot of stuff. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being on here with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the invite, and I enjoy these discussions.
That's
Spending a
great.
lot of time on tariffs, obviously.
I will tell you, as I said in my beginning here, tariffs used to be this little thing like, yeah, it's out there, but nobody really thinks about it. Now with the new the president coming in and making his agenda, some people look at it as good, some people look at it as bad, and everybody's entitled to their opinion, but you're the expert. So let's talk about it. When you look at your early experiences at Hallmark, how did they shape your understanding of global supply chain strategy and risk management? In big company, you had a lot of responsibility there. So how would you say that it helped you when you look at things globally?
Well, I was fortunate that they sent me to Hong Kong when I was in my 20s, which is just unbelievable when I think back on that. It was like, hey,
Five
we'd
years
like you,
ago, 5 years
uh,
ago.
we'd like you to go, and you have one day to decide. And I didn't even have a passport, and they had a sourcing operation over there in various offices that originally started in Japan when Hallmark bought a children's book company and eventually migrated into other product categories, which were never going to be made in the United States. Candle accessories, Christmas ornaments, that type of thing. And so I moved to Hong Kong in the 80s, and China had not really opened up yet.
Wow.
It was just beginning, and my earliest exposure to supply chain diversification was when I got there, because a big part of what I was tasked with doing was to go to other countries. Again, this is before the internet, there was no playbook. Go to other countries and find suppliers that could make Hallmark Christmas ornaments, because the labor market in Hong Kong was shrinking, and China hadn't opened up yet. And the Hong Kong guys didn't want to go back into China for several reasons, because they left China in the early 50s and didn't want to go back because they weren't ready to go back and set up a factory yet. So some did, some retired, but the labor market was contracting pretty severely in Hong Kong. So you had no choice but to try to go to other countries in order to develop new suppliers. Very reminiscent of what's going on today. You
Yeah.
hear about people talk about China plus one. Well, I was doing Hong Kong plus five.
Wow.
So,
Wow. How did that experience really shape your views on diversifying sourcing and looking at things from a global dependency? It's very different than it is today, but it's also kind of the same. So
mhm.
how did it affect you?
Well, the that early exposure, I think, was critical, and we took a long view with what we did, looking at multiple countries, multiple suppliers, even back then. And when China began to open up, there were trade issues associated with China. Keep in mind, they were not in the WTO. They didn't have most favored nation trade status. So we were occasionally subjected to special 301 tariffs and those types of things prior to China getting that trade status with the United States. As a matter of fact, in the 90s, when I went back, I spent 3 years in Washington lobbying on behalf of China's trade status. That was part of my job. I did it as part of a delegation with the American Chamber of Commerce. So I've had multiple exposures to risk mitigation when it comes to making sure you've got multiple locations in terms of where products are manufactured, and that's really what shaped me in this environment.
Is it mostly to avoid disruption, avoid tariff implications, both?
Yes, and once we began to do more work in China, we were constantly concerned about, and I can remember with the handover in 1997, and after Tiananmen Square, there were concerns the border was going to be closed. There was concern that we wouldn't be able to get product out. Most of those concerns ended up being unfounded. The genesis of the everybody taking this kind of long view about, well, we better have a China plus one strategy or a China plus two strategy
Yeah.
because of the geopolitical issues.
Yep.
And now it's kind of come full circle. Things have been, suppressed down into a procurement organization. Over the last 20 years, tariffs was not something that was top of mind. And, since Liberation Day, that's front page news just about everywhere.
I couldn't agree more. So you have a website, and again, this is a little bit of a unique name here. Supply chain is not the unique part, but it's supply chain AI, ALYITICS. When you launched this website, what critical blind spots did you see in how companies handle trade policy and really tariff exposure? Because as you said, until Liberation Day, I mean, tariffs are just tariffs, right? I mean, it's just another word out there in the dictionary for the most part. Nobody
Mhm.
really talked about it.
The
You see,
genesis of the company and that name was nothing magical. It was, well, I've always taken the view that supply chain was a math problem and analytics was probably taken. So I just had a play on words and decided, okay, I'm going to change it up a little bit. And so it wasn't any more thoughtful than that. But supply chain is really just total cost to serve front to back. You've got raw materials, you've got fulfillment on the back end, you've got logistics costs, and it's always been a math problem. Lowest
yeah,
total cost from A to B. And now in the tariff environment, it's a little different because now you have to overlay the risk mitigation component with that. And sometimes you have to pay a little bit more in order to mitigate risk.
hmm
And that becomes more of a strategic question for the company in terms of how they manage their business. But, what I'm seeing, and I typically, when I interact with companies, I end up, through an assessment process or talking to them, I usually end up putting them in one of three categories. They're either in a kind of an immature category where they're being very reactive. They don't really have active management going on in terms of tariffs and what to do about tariffs. The next bucket is they're diversifying or trying to diversify their supply base. They're reviewing their classifications. They're pretty active in the space. The groups that are most more strategic in their thought process in the companies, and this isn't just large companies, although I'd say for the most part they're pretty good. Um, it's a C-suite issue for them. You've got the entire leadership team engaged in terms of, okay, what are the scenarios we're looking at, depending upon what happens with tariffs in certain countries? What are we doing to diversify? Are we deploying any technology tools or anything to help us with this? Are our customs brokers doing a good job for us? Do we have the right trade attorneys to ask questions? Um, and how are we mitigating that risk? What are we doing in terms of absorbing any of those costs, passing them on to our customers? What's the strategy there? And then oftentimes, what are our customers doing? And how are they responding to what we're doing? And then the competitive landscape as well. And oftentimes with the more mature categories, you get into things like, bonded warehouses, free trade zones, deploying things like that that also help mitigate tariffs overall. So that's probably more on the mature side, but again, it's an engaged C-suite that's really looking at a lot of things rather than something that we'd rather not talk about, and we're just taking the hit on the immature side.
yep, I couldn't agree more. So when we look at the tariff economy and your recent article, which is titled "The $1.5 billion Signal," you referred to tariffs as really economic warfare as a playbook, right? And I can totally see that. I really do. How should business leaders in general, regardless of where they are, deal with or interpret this new reality?
Well, it's not going anywhere. The ultimate tariff percentage is really a policy decision based upon the administration, and we'll see what comes out of the Supreme Court ruling on the emergency authorization. By that's a maybe even a discussion for another day, but the tariffs are policy decisions. But the reason this is going to be around for a while is the trade balance, the trade lanes, the geopolitical tensions, issues that get overlaid with what's happening with Russian oil versus rare earth minerals versus we're
Yeah,
really not happy about how you ran your last election, or we're not really happy about that ad you ran about Ronald Reagan. So it's a pretty diverse landscape in terms of what ends up being policy and how it gets deployed. So I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. And the other reason why I think that is if you look at where the tariff revenue will be over a 12-month or a 24-month period, it's probably going to end up somewhere between 200 to 400 million billion annually, depending upon what sticks. Well, as soon as that goes into the treasury, they're not going to give that up anytime soon. And but when you think about it, and I researched the people that advised Trump before he got elected, where were they on trade, the trade deficits, a whole host of issues, and they pretty specifically said, we're going to probably put countries into three buckets. We're going to have friends and family. That's probably going to be 10 to 15%. And 10 to 15% is the new zero.
yeah,
Okay, so it's
yeah.
it's not going to drop below that most likely.
And like you
And then
said,
you
not
got
when we
our
see that money coming in.
yeah, then you got your trading partners in the middle. So that's probably going to be north, maybe somewhere between 15 and 25%. And you've got Canada, Mexico, India, perhaps other people in there that don't necessarily fall into the friends and family category. And then you've got the competitive end, which is where China will end up being, and China's probably not going to come out of that. And after the meetings this past week, they're sitting at about 45, 47%, I think, after they reduce the tariffs down. Well, anything north of 35 is feels almost like a decoupling. It's like, we're really not sure we want your stuff. And so when you look at where you're sourcing from and those percentages, in addition to the placement of those countries based upon how important they are to the U.S. agenda, those are factors that go into what your strategies need to be.
Well, I
And
mean,
if you're,
for costing and pricing
yeah,
and everything.
yeah. So if you're kind of in that responsive mode, so let's just say you're in the immature category and you're sourcing from China, you're in the worst possible place to
Mhm.
be. And when it comes to items that are high labor component, the big winners with this will probably be Vietnam and Mexico and India. And I think the India situation will sort itself out. And then if it's low labor, more high tech, you're looking at Japan, South Korea, potentially Canada, and then reshoring to the United States. But there's industries that will not come back. We've lost 90,000 factories and 5 million jobs over the last 20 years. High labor stuff is not going to come back. It's going to be high tech. It's going to be things tied to the military, AI, those types of things. And we've got 5 million open jobs right now that are not being filled. You have 7 million people that aren't working, and you've got the AI component on top of that. So the reindustrialization of what that looks like is going to be very, very interesting
I agree.
at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I agree with you, especially with AI now entering the fold. That's we just saw what happened with Meta and some of the other ones.
Hmm.
So I totally agree with you. When you look at a home perspective here in the United States, where are companies in the United States most vulnerable when it comes to tariffs, and how do they mitigate risk against that?
The better companies right now are looking at redesigning product in order to mitigate their tariff risk, which is possible in some instances. But the reason this rare earth thing is rather dire is there's not a lot of options out there.
Oh, you're correct.
And I published an article today that said this rare earth thing should become the next Manhattan Project for every Western company. And, China kind of put a 1 year pause on it, but that could change overnight. And I think it was a real wake up call when they put those exports controls in for a lot of countries. It's like, holy cow, we are more vulnerable than we thought we were going to be through this whole thing. The United States, I think, is working hard with its allies in order to try to shore that up. And then the other areas, pharmaceuticals, and of course we've had a lot of supply chain risks tied to pharmaceuticals. But then you look at steel and aluminum, that's hit people pretty hard. And but you look at some of the things that come from the rare earth minerals. I mean, you can shut down an automotive factory in no time.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, okay, are you going to start stockpiling when you can? And I think a lot of companies are trying to do that.
Stockpiling is it makes sense for the long term, but obviously it affects short term with cash flow. So there's all sorts of different problems when it comes.
Well, and a lot of the small to mid-sized companies I work with can't really afford to take a big inventory
Yeah.
position.
Oh, I totally get it. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but let's expand on this a little bit. When you look at decoupling, from China, talk to me a little bit about what you think some of the biggest misconceptions are out there.
You mean the degree of decoupling?
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Well, the biggest problem is China's a juggernaut. I mean, the infrastructure, the manufacturing base that they have, the logistics infrastructure, the technology. There are automated factories over there that don't even have their lights on. Fully automated. And there's two people in the building to make sure everything's running okay. Well, I don't think we have anything like that in the United States. Uh,
Not a lot. Not a
not
lot.
so, and it takes years in order to try to replicate something like that. And
Yes.
you look at it, and you got to give them credit because they're putting a ton into robotics and technology. And it's like, well, why would they be doing that when they've got such a large population that they're trying to keep employed? Well, the population is a component of it, but they may not be able to sustain population growth in order to, um, you know, produce for the country. So the automation could be a very smart long-term play for them in addition to keeping costs low. So it's fascinating to see how they're making these decisions, but it's certainly the long game. And for anybody purely trying to decouple, it's difficult. You can do it, but it takes time. And of course, the United States is touting their direct foreign investment commitments at this point at $17 trillion, heading to $20 trillion. Those things take time if they're ever even going to happen. I'm not naive enough to think that that's a real number, but let's just say it's half. It's a big number.
Yeah, it's a big
But even then, it takes years to put that infrastructure in place.
anything with a T in front of it's a big number. Um, I'm just curious of your opinion on something. I didn't prep you for this one, but it just happened. When you look at South Korea yesterday throwing a $350 billion advance payment out, or however you want to refer to it, to buy down tariffs. I mean, they see this as tariffs are not going anywhere. And they see this as like, how can we play in this thing, and look at the long game? What are your feelings on that?
Well, I haven't been surprised by a lot, because Trump has basically said, or the administration's basically said, you're going to get preferential treatment if you invest in the United States in terms of high tech manufacturing, bringing jobs here, that type of thing. And they've said from the beginning, if you want to avoid tariffs, just make your stuff here.
Yeah.
And they've started with that basic premise. But when you look at what some of these countries are doing, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, you know, it becomes pretty clear what the price is in order to get a lower tariff rate. The situation is still a bit chaotic and fluid every day.
Yeah. I don't see it changing anytime soon.
No, I don't either.
When
I
you look
really
at different leadership positions, you look at, you look at finance, you look at operations, you look at procurement leaders, supply chain leaders. What role should each or a combination of each play when it comes to what now people are calling tariff management? Tariff
you
like,
know
used to be this thing, and now it's a whole business.
and you I'd say on the financial side, I always tell people, if you have four, let's just say you have 4 to 6 scenarios, and these include where you're going to source from, what you might do with pricing, how much of it are you going to try to absorb? Are there other initiatives you can take within your business in order to mitigate some of these costs? The finance people need to be front and center on that, okay? Because they're really steering the C-suite in terms of the financials and what all this means. The supply chain people are the ones that are really tabling the alternatives and bubbling those up into those various scenarios. Each one will come with a different level of risk. So the supply chain people really drive that. The procurement people are really the ones in the midst of, supplier development, where to go, who to talk to, whether we should be placing small orders to start with and what that looks like. And then the transportation and logistics folks are critical to this because as we've learned through this tariff disruption, these trade lanes and the costs associated with them can be highly volatile when people are moving volume all over the place and
Yes, they
you've
can.
too many empty containers going in the wrong direction.
Yep.
That's sometimes not a very good thing. So I think everybody has their role, but given the fact that this has been kind of under wraps for 20 years, now it's top of mind for a lot of companies. And many of the companies that I talk to and work with, they just want to know, what steps do I take today? What steps do I take tomorrow? What are the logical things that I need to do to build options and to make my business more resilient?
Yep.
That's the key really at the end of the day. And I am absolutely amazed though, many of the companies I talk to, the first question I ask them, well, have you talked to your supplier about shared pain? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you're getting a 15% hit if you talk to your supplier about splitting that, because they want to keep your business.
Yeah.
And it's like,
That's
no, we
it.
really haven't done that. Well, that's the easiest thing to do.
That's
Just try to,
astonishing. That's astonishing to me. Let's move to technology a little bit. I'm a technology guy, so I got a couple questions here.
yes,
Technology, AI, big buzzword out there next to tariffs, right? AI used to be a
yeah.
big buzzword. Tariffs took over. How can AI improve tariff forecasting and really supply chain modeling, factoring tariffs into things now?
Well, I think initially, the work that I do, where it comes into play right out of the gate is I like to get their data and look at 1 to 2, kind of a 1 to 2 year look back
Hmm.
and say, what are your codes? What are your classifications? And look at those, utilizing AI to say, hey, is this accurate? Is there an opportunity where any of these misclassified? Did you leave any money on the table? Start there because with any of these assessments and with anything do with tariffs, you've got to have some degree of confidence that what you've done so far is correct. And then if it's not, then you can make changes moving forward, but you may be able to get some of that back depending upon what the error was, with the tariff classification. Because I always tell people, I have to have a number at the beginning of the process and I have to have a number at the end of the process. So when you're talking about total landed cost with what you're doing now, a big component of that is what you're paying for tariffs right now. And then at the end of the process, depending on how many scenarios you have, what that number is at the other end. And then it gets more complicated because you have different landed costs. You might have a different tariff structure. The CFO might be talking to me saying, we're gonna take a 4% hit. So build that into the scenarios. So then you have a number at the back end of it. And once you get those scenarios, then you can look at each one and say, okay, what are the triggering events that are going to force us to go from scenario A to scenario B? And when your leadership team starts having those kind of discussions, then it gets really interesting.
Do you see like a lot of modern ERP, or maybe people are still using Excel, what I call the Excel Olympics?
Sure,
Do you see those helping in quantifying, like, honestly, the true cost of tariffs? Just mentioned 4%. It could be 2%, could be 6%. That's a big number.
sure.
It costs a lot of
Yeah,
money, you know?
yep, yep. Well, if you have the opportunity to set up a digital twin or something where you can run those scenarios through that and cost it out and get decent numbers, that's a good thing at the end of the day. Let's just say, for instance, I have a client and I've got 2 years worth of their data, and there's an AI monitoring solution that's out there that where they might charge a subscription fee for that, where you load in your volume, all your tariff classifications and everything else, and it's sending you alerts if something changes. That's a pretty good, platform to have, even if you're a small to medium-sized company. Having a interactive tool on the back end for what I would describe as the more strategic work is another big opportunity. And I can't, and to be honest with you, I can't keep up with the changes in your space.
Yeah, I
I,
get it.
I
I
mean,
can't keep up with the changes in your space. So when you look ahead, whether it's a couple years, 5 years, whatever time frame down the line, are tariffs going to be a permanent feature? When you look at global trade, I mean, they always
yeah.
have been, but like I said, we talked earlier, they were just like this little line item, not a
Oh,
big
sure.
deal.
Well, and a lot of people realize that before we had income tax, it was all tariffs.
It
We
was
we
all
didn't.
tariffs, yeah.
Yeah, we didn't have, and they're like, really? I said, yeah. After the turn of the century, it went from
What was it?
tariffs to
1913 income tax came in.
yeah, around 13 or 17, I think, 1917 maybe. I might have the
I'm
date
not
wrong,
dating
but
myself, but
yeah,
I just might have looked into that a little bit.
yeah. And so they've always been out there in some form. I think kind of where maybe there was a few areas where you could look back and say maybe we got off track. After World War II, we're of course interested in helping Japan and Germany rebuild. Well, if they're bringing goods into the United States duty free beyond the point where they're no longer a developing economy or a rebuilding economy, okay, is that the right thing to do? Um, People talk about free trade, and they throw it out there loosely. Well, there really never has been free trade. Everything's been subject to some sort of review. And then when you look at, what happened with China's trade status, with most favored nation trade status, the WTO, and then the original NAFTA agreement with Mexico and Canada, just things that, sounded good, looked good on paper, but they were really, really debilitating to the workforce in the United States with jobs being exported. And so we've got not only the trade deficit, but we've got a growing wealth gap in the United States, and it's tough to bring that back. So I think they're going to be there in some form. I've told a lot of people that I think the end game with this tariff thing was the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I think they know that if that goes away, it's game over. And that's one of the key drivers, I think, behind this tariff strategy with the administration.
When you deal with some of your clients, or people call and pick your brain, what do you tell them about building like procurement supply chains that can adapt when policy changes so fast? I mean, these tariffs, for the most part, they were talked about for a long time, but man, when they hit, and all of a sudden people freaked out. So what would you tell them what kind of controls would you have recommend that they put in place so that they're not caught off guard when policy changes?
I think if they get to their first math, that's key, making sure the current tariffs are correct, landed costs are correct, and that type of thing. Um, Oftentimes, I'm talking to companies that don't even have a procurement department.
Oh
They've
well.
got people that have three hats. They're relying heavily on their customs brokers and freight forwarders, which is fine. A lot of small companies do that. But with the risk level going up, those things need to be constantly reviewed. And a lot of companies that are importing, smaller companies, are everything's delivered duty paid, and they hand the whole thing over to their supplier to do for them. And if their business is on a growth trajectory, they owe it to themselves to begin to pull that apart. Look at contracts. What options do you have in terms of, do you have contracts? What options do you have to move volume around? What's your ongoing process in terms of trying new suppliers and new geographies? Are you building that type of thing in your strategic plans? And oftentimes companies aren't. And I think the most important thing anyone can do as a first step is really do a deep dive in terms of what they're getting from where, what are the components, where are they coming from, is all this stuff documented? Because customs is auditing a lot of companies right now, and they're going to add resources to audit more. So it's really important for companies, I think, big and small, to really make sure they've got their documentation in order in terms of where everything's coming from, looking at their contracts, what flexibility they have, because the audit thing is a real component as well.
Here's a final question for you, and this is one I always like to ask because it helps us get to know you a little bit better. If I took your best friend and I locked them up in a room and I refused to let them out until they told me something that you, Dan, would never want the world to know about you, what would that be?
Oh, it probably is one of my, you know, hobbies too numerous to mention over the last 40 years, and they've gotten more expensive.
Give me a recent hobby that you took on that you
Well, a lot of people don't know that I breed Labradors. So,
good like wow.
I yeah, so I'm a fledgling Labrador wannabe breeder, and
I've had
um,
two labs, a lot of hair, a
yeah,
lot of hair.
yeah.
I always say they would hold the flashlight for the burglar if a burglar
But
broke.
that's one thing that a lot of people don't know about me.
That's
So
awesome, man. That's awesome.
I'm not short of hobbies and interests.
Good.
So,
That's great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. How do people find you if they want to find you? Give them a couple of
well,
options.
they can find me on LinkedIn. I don't know if we're going to publish show notes or
Yep.
anything with this, but they can find me on LinkedIn. I would encourage people to follow me there because then they can see some of the articles I've published. My tariff work on LinkedIn really started right after Liberation Day, and I published an 11 article series on what they are and where they came from and what you need to do about them. And
Is
that
that
was
on
back
LinkedIn or your
that was
website?
on LinkedIn.
This is a hot topic, and you are an expert on it. So
I try to do a little coaching and mentoring along the way, regardless of the organization. And frankly, that's the biggest leave behind I can give them is they're people being a little more educated than before I got there. So that's ultimately my goal.
that's awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Dan. We will
Yeah,
publish this thing for you, and we will publish your ways that people can contact you. I mean, you have a lot of experience. You've done a lot of great stuff. As tariffs and trade shifts and technological disruption continue to reshape logistics, you really have put a lot of information out there that can help people. So whether it's supply chain analytics.ai or on LinkedIn at Dan Krouse, find Dan, ask him some questions. Good guy to interact with. I really appreciate your time and thanks for joining.
thanks a lot. I enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it.